In terms of sexual orientation, among Americans who identify as homosexual, lesbian, or bisexual, 41% claim to have no religious identification. And I saw another one that said 47%, so somewhere in the 40s there. And I could not find any data specifically on transgender or people who identify as transgender, so I don't know. So how does this relate to social and political issues? Well, I think I'll end there. No, okay, here comes the more controversial part, unless I've already, I don't know, maybe what I've said is already controversial. I don't know. I'll end here. This is what I'm going to say. It's just a correlation. It's just a correlation. It could be spurious. There are other factors at play. But in predicting how people's positions, one of the strongest predictors is strength of religiosity or strength of secularity. Meaning, the more strongly religious a person is in terms of church attendance, faith in God, or just identification, or the less religious they are in terms of secularity, atheism, etc., is an extremely strong predictor of where they're going to fall on the key political and social issues of today. More so than educational attainment, race, gender, where in the country they live, etc., etc. So it's one of the most robust predictors we have sociologically. And again, these are just correlations. However, let's take, for example, climate change, global warming. While 58% of secular Americans accept the fact that human activity is causing global warming, only 17% of evangelical Protestants accept this. If we look at mass incarceration, the secular are far more likely to be critical of it. They're far more likely to be aware of the racial disparities inherent in it. And the strongly religious, particularly evangelicals, not to pick on them, but are the least sympathetic to the problems of mass incarceration and the least likely to care about the racial disparities. Women's equality, women's reproductive rights, equality for gays and lesbians. In fact, on gays and lesbians, it should be pointed out that there are, in fact, no secular institutional organizations fighting against the rights of gays and lesbians. Are there secular Americans who don't support the right? Of course. Are there homophobic secular Americans? Of course. They don't organize. The only opposition to gay and lesbian rights is religious in this country. That's it. And of course, there are a lot of religious people who totally accept gays and lesbians. I mean, I'm not saying it's either or. We know there's a spectrum here. But of the oppositional institutional forces fighting against gay and lesbian rights, they're only religious in orientation. Safety for the transgendered, Palestinian rights, Tibetan rights, stem cell research, the right to die, sex ed, honest sex ed, animal rights, gun toting and gun violence, universal health care for all, rational drug policies. On each and every one of these issues, you can correlate how people are going to feel or vote based on strength of religiosity or strength of secularity. So in my opinion, this is very significant, this rise of the nuns. Nearly 78 million millennials in this country. And that's more than there are baby boomers, which is 76 million. So by 2020, millennials will represent almost 40% of American voters. They're not as religious as any generation prior. Now the question is, will their secularity be a factor in how they vote or not? Will it be other issues at play? And I think these are the kind of things we need to then discuss and tease out in our panel. So I'll end there. Thanks for listening. Sorry it was a lot of information, but I look forward to the conversation. Is that good? Okay, thank you.
This is the keynote panel. What we're going to ask of you guys is to kind of respond to what Phil said and also expand on it with the context of what you guys have been through. And let's give Phil another hand for what a great job he did. All right, I'm going to introduce Evan Stewart and Jackie Frost. They're both PhD candidates in sociology at the University of Minnesota, and they're studying civic and political engagement among the non-religious. And I said we just want to respond and expand on what Phil said. So we're going to jump right into the first question. This one's, we're going to start with you, Jackie. Okay. Jackie, as someone who studies non-religious community groups and volunteering among the non-religious, what can you tell us about how the non-religious get involved with their communities?
Yeah, great. Thanks, Nick, and thanks so much, Phil, for setting the groundwork with all those wonderful statistics. So I'm Jackie Frost. I'm a graduate student in sociology at the University of Minnesota. And for the past 6 or 7 years, I've been studying this non-religious demographic that we're talking about tonight. And I mostly focus on the community groups that they join and create kind of devoted to celebrating and developing non-religious identities. So a lot of you I kind of recognize tonight from various secular organizations in the cities. So a lot of you probably know what I'm talking about in terms of social and political groups that non-religious people kind of collectively join and develop in order to celebrate non-religious identities, kind of talk about what non-religion means for them. So most notably, I have been studying the Sunday Assembly, which is a kind of church-like organization for non-religious people. So in light of the kind of research that I've been doing in terms of how non-religious people get involved and how much they volunteer, I had kind of two sets of thoughts in relation to Phil's talk and kind of thinking about how non-religious people are civically engaged. So Phil mentioned that non-religion informs people's social and political views pretty strongly. And there are, as I said, there's a growing number of political and social groups that are devoted to developing these non-religious social and political worldviews. And in recent research, actually, a recent study in 2016 found that in the US alone, there are 1,400 individual non-religious organizations in the US. So, and these are continuing to grow. For example, the Sunday Assembly that I studied just started organizing in 2013, and they already have 70 chapters in the US and abroad. So a really growing kind of landscape of non-religious organizations to get involved with. So thinking about the title of the symposium, Are the Nuns Done with Civic Engagement? I think that we might want to think about it the other way in terms of the non-religious are in many ways just kind of starting to get involved as non-religious people. These kind of political and social groups are just they're starting to organize around what it means to be non-religious and what it means to be a political voting bloc that might have a say in politics. So the assumption that just because the nuns many of them have left religion, it doesn't necessarily mean that they are leaving civic engagement and leaving their communities entirely. It is an interesting question to ask: if the non-religious are leaving religion, are they going to stop being civically engaged? Because religious organizations are the most common organization through which Americans volunteer through. But I think that can be changing quickly as these non-religious organizations start to grow. So that was one thought, kind of thinking of how they might just be starting instead of being done with civic engagement. And then my second thought is related to kind of the different identity labels that you mentioned in terms of atheist, agnostic, nothing in particular. So you mentioned that only about 11% of this 30% demographic kind of identifies as not believing in God, whereas the much larger proportion of non-religious people are kind of nothing in particular. They don't have a strong non-religious label. And so what I'm finding in my research with Dr. Penny Edgell, who you'll hear from pretty soon, is that identity labels really matter for whether and how non-religious people do get involved and volunteer. So most surveys, like Phil explained, you kind of get an option of if you're religious or if you're not religious, right? And we've only started recently developing categories for non-religious people to kind of put if they're an atheist or an agnostic or nothing in particular, those categories are pretty new on surveys. And so most research on non-religious people kind of groups them all together into this one category. But we broke it out and looked at, well, do atheists volunteer more than agnostics, or do nothing in particulars volunteer more? And we found that atheists actually volunteer as much or more than religious people, but it's the nothing in particulars who we're finding aren't being as engaged as other non-religious people and religious people. And so one thing to kind of open up to the panel is thinking about how it kind of requires this kind of strong identity or belief one way or the other to be kind of drawn into these groups that do the volunteering, and how that might be a problematic way to approach non-religious people in terms of getting them civically involved. So I was wondering, in terms of those political and social and moral views you talked about, do you in your research find any differences between kind of self-avowed atheists and the more ambivalent non-religious people in terms of holding those views? So I'll open that up for you guys to talk about.
I think Jackie raises a really good point about the distinction between folks who explicitly identify as atheist agnostic, folks who sort of more broadly identify as nothing in particular. My research focuses on the political engagement among America's growing non-religious population. So I spend a lot of time deep in survey research, right, looking at a lot of the political and social issues that Phil mentioned at the end of his talk. And I think one of the big questions on a lot of folks' minds when they first hear about the trend of the rise in the non-religious is, is this going to have a massive political impact in the United States? Many of us are very familiar with the historical legacy of the religious right in the United States and their development and mobilization through the 80s and 90s. And it's sort of an open question as to whether the nuns are going to have a similar sort of massive effect on American politics. But folks are very skeptical about this because so far the exit polling we've seen suggests that non-religious people, religiously unaffiliated people, are less likely to turn out to vote. But to build on Jackie's point, some of my research that I've done recently has looked at validated voter turnout data to assess whether and how these different sort of groups of non-religious people do actually turn out to vote. And what I find is that atheists and agnostics, they turn out at very similar rates to Protestants, Catholics, and Jewish Americans. And it's really the nothing in particular group that is less likely to turn out to vote. And so what we know from these findings then is that there's a bifurcation among the nuns, right? They're not all the same. They're not all thinking the same or behaving the same. And there's a lot of similar sort of divergent trends in their attitudes about different issues and how they mobilize. And so I think this really opens up space to talk a lot about how different organizations want to work with non-religious citizens, right? And how different organizations want to appeal to non-religious citizens. Because I think that opens up space to talk about a lot of potential, a lot of untapped organizing potential, as Jackie mentioned also with the social and community organizations that non-religious people join. So in sort of building on that, I think it's also a question of whether and how currently existing social organizations and political institutions are incorporating non-religious citizens into their organizing actions and their advocacy work and sort of their everyday political lives.
Phil, do you have anything to say about that? Or?
Sure.
Okay.
I guess a couple things I would say. I think that yes, there's a huge difference between people who identify as atheist or agnostic and those that just say nothing in particular, right? That's a different orientation. In other words, the self-declared atheist probably has thought about it more, has taken on this label, and has a stronger sense of identity, often maybe has a stronger sense of what it is they don't believe in, and so just maybe more motivated to be engaged. Whereas the others who some of us call them apatheists, they're not necessarily atheists, they're apatheists. Like they just don't think about it and they don't really care. And then you could see how that would translate into not caring about other things. But I think to me, a more important one is, are you communally engaged or not? And this, Robert Putnam's book was mentioned earlier, American Grace. And there's so much data that shows that non-religious people are less engaged in charitable work, financially, and even just donating time, so time and money, than their religious peers. A lot of research on this. But we never quite knew why. And so what Putnam and Campbell did was they went in and they teased it out. And what they found was something really interesting. It wasn't whether you were a believer or not. It was whether you engaged in your community or not. So what they found was theists, people who believe in God but were not church affiliated, did not donate time or money to any significant degree. In fact, were quite lower. And atheists who were involved in a religious congregation, for whatever reason, the choir, husband, whatever, were just as likely to be charitably engaged in terms of time and money than their peers. And we've also seen research, I think Luke Galen, that non-religious people who are affiliated in non-religious groups, like Sunday Assembly, again, high boost of charitable giving over the national average. So what that tells us is, I think it's less about what your actual belief about God is, and important, are you affiliated with some kind of community that is providing you with opportunities to be charitable? You know, hey, we're having a food drive. Hey, we're going to help with a local school. Hey, we're doing this or that. And when you're presented with regular and frequent opportunities to be altruistic, it's more likely you will. And so I just want to point that out, that yes, I think we need to tease out that identity and orientation and belief and how that correlates, but I think right now the data points to, are you embedded in a community or not, a religious community or not? And I think that's, and then the last thing I'll say, I know I just spoke for half an hour, but I think also what's tricky is that mobilizing religious groups has a long tradition in our going back to the Quakers' opposition to slavery, all the way up to the civil rights movement in Montgomery, and so on and so forth. So I think there's a long tradition of religious groups being able to mobilize their members around certain social issues. And we know that today, if a certain religious movement takes a stand on something, they've got an instant group of people willing to donate, write emails, march, do whatever it takes. And many people's politics are embedded in their religious identity, be that a faith identity, be that a tribal affiliation. I'm not so sure that secular folks, the nuns, will be motivated to be politically or socially engaged on the basis of their secularity alone. In other words, they may care about climate change, they may care about growing inequality in America or whatnot, but I don't know if they're mobilizing as secular people around these issues. To me, that's the big question. Are these just correlates? Yeah, people who are non-religious happen to understand the science behind climate change and want it to end, but are they motivated because of their secularity, or is that just a kind of epiphenomenal correlate, if that makes sense? So that's kind of what I'm struggling with and trying to understand right now. Thank you.
Do you want to say something more, Evan?
I was just going to ask a quick follow-up. Do you think that that's a supply-side problem or a demand-side problem? Do you think that that's non-religious people who are not necessarily motivated by their non-religion to engage, turn out, whatever? Or do you think that that's due to a real lack of effort among many well-established political or social elites to recruit and appeal to non-religious populations?
Wow. Probably a combination of both, and I don't know enough about it, so I'd like to hear your theory. However, based on my knowledge of things, if anything is gonna, at this point, get people to vote, let's say, on the basis of their secularity, we couldn't ask for a better shepherd of that than Betsy DeVos, Scott Pruitt, Donald Trump, Rick Warren. I mean, this roundtable in our White House will generate way more active secular voter participation, I think, than any kind of outreach the AHA could do or something like that.
All right. Well, I would think we would like to move on to the second question. This one's for Evan. And you pointed out that you kind of study like the political impact of like the non-religious. And so the question we want to ask you is, are they having an effect in U.S. politics?
So that's a really good question. You know, are they having a tangible effect? And it's difficult to tease out and it's difficult to measure because we oftentimes don't get very good measures of non-religiosity, as Phil kind of pointed out. He raised a lot of really good questions about, are you talking about people's beliefs? Are you talking about their affiliation? Are you talking about their practice and their engagement in their communities? But this gets to your question. You'd like to hear my theory, I guess, on where they fit into politics and whether it's about demand or supply for political engagement. I found in my own work on social and political attitudes among non-religious Americans that there's a lot of splits. I mentioned these. So while atheists and agnostics are highly engaged, highly motivated, often very progressive, as Phil pointed out, when you split off the nothing in particulars, I find that they're much more centrist and moderate. Still progressive, right? But not nearly as staunchly progressive or as consistently progressive on all issues as atheists and agnostics tend to be. And that's because people leave religion for all kinds of different reasons, right? Some people make a conscious, ideologically motivated choice to leave religion, right? And they really stick to claim for that. More and more Americans grow up without religion, have many friends who are not religious, sort of drift away from religious institutions. And so they're just sort of de facto non-religious. And what those different experiences have, in my view, is they shape the way people think about religion, not only in their private lives and what it means to them, right? Not only their individual religious beliefs and practices, but also in their public lives, right? How they think about the role of religious authority in the public sphere. What is the proper role of religious authority in the government? Should political leaders have strong religious beliefs, or should they not? Or is that not important? And what I found in some published research, again, working with Dr. Penny Edgell, she's our dissertation advisor, so, is that these views on religion in public life really structure the way Americans think about all kinds of issues, particularly how they view religious minorities in the United States, particularly how they view tolerance towards groups that they do not agree with, whether or not they are tolerant. And in some unpublished research, this has really strong effects on how people think about the welfare state and the social safety net, how people think about racial issues in the United States, and even whether they believe in human-caused climate change. And so what I think about whether or not they're going to have a political effect, I think right now we can see sort of the beginnings of the political effect. I mentioned earlier that atheists and agnostics do turn out to vote, but the nothing in particulars are less likely to turn out. And I think the goal, if we want them to have a stronger political effect, or if organizations want them to have a stronger political effect, there needs to be a lot more cultural work done to establish those views, to get people to think about how they feel about religion in public life, right? And sort of to activate these beliefs. And that's why I said earlier that there's a lot of untapped potential to sort of draw on these groups as new political coalitions. And it may have unpredictable effects. They may be mobilized by political interests that we wouldn't necessarily assume would be the ones motivating them.
Yeah, and I think that makes me think of another important thing to keep in mind is that we aren't just acting as religious or non-religious people, right? So we are gendered, raced, classed people who are motivated by other identities other than religion and non-religion. So thinking about the millennials being kind of the most likely to be non-religious, they're also the least likely to vote. They're also the least likely to be affiliated with a group or to want to take on an identity label, which influences their involvement in these kinds of groups too, right? So thinking about intersectionality and other identities that are influencing and connecting and intersecting with non-religion is important to remember.
Yeah, and on that note, I'll just say that also, even when I was talking about the way religiosity and secularity correlates with people's positions on these issues, that's not the same for white Americans and black Americans. Very different. So you're absolutely right. These things aren't so clear-cut at all.
Well, do we have anything else we want to hash out? Any questions from the audience? Yeah, right here. You got a microphone.
Now comes the fun part.
Yeah, I'm curious if anybody has looked to see retrospectively what the makeup of nuns was percentage-wise in the Rally for Sanity. That was the Jon Stewart rally. When we had one here in Minnesota, there were a lot of folks there who could not identify or would not identify as being religious or non-religious. But there seemed to be a lot of folks just coming out of the woodwork. And I'm wondering whether or not calling for people to engage in sanity is one way to activate the nuns, or whether or not statistically they were not represented very highly in that effort. So just curious if anybody's ever thought about doing a study like that.
I don't know if there's any research on that, but I think you're onto something, and your hunches are. It would be nice to see if your hunches are empirically grounded, and definitely something we should be looking into, to be sure.
Well, it's similar to closely around that. I think was the Reason Rally, which is kind of was intentionally meant to get atheists and non-religious people to come out and kind of stand for reason, which is similar to sanity, I think. So, no.
No, I wouldn't say that. Reason has been conflated with secularism by the secular community because it's a great way to get one up on the rest of the community. So if you say you are reasoning and everybody else isn't, it's a great sell. But I'm not so sure the Rally for Sanity people were all equating a worldview with the process of reasoning.
It seems to me when you ask questions, are you religious or non-religious, most or many people would tick off, well, is that about a set of beliefs and doctrines, or is it about affiliation with an organization? What happens when narrative becomes the focus of the question? What are the narratives that transcend the particularity of your life, that give your life meaning, that create community, that inform your engagement in the world? Then what happens to the conversation? What happens to the analysis? And what happens to how we think differently about the binary religious or non-religious? And how do we tease out the narrative question among people who self-define as non-religious?
It's called an in-depth interview. There's just no way to get at that, and this is just the fundamental among social scientists. It's there's survey research and quantitative research, and then there's qualitative, ethnographic, anthropological, and we need both. And both have their strengths and both have their weaknesses. So, in fact, I'm not a numbers person. I do in-depth interviews. When I've lived for 2 years in Scandinavia. I sit down and have conversations over coffee. Very pleasant, I must say. And there you can get at exactly what you're talking about, those deep narratives. So you get a much deeper, a much more nuanced, a much richer understanding of people's worldviews that you can't fit in a box. In 14 months, I was able to do 150 in-depth interviews. I mean, it can give me this depth, but I can't make generalizations about all of Denmark or Sweden, let alone. So surveys are the only tool we have to get information on large populations. And what that means is it's going to be a blunt tool. We're going to force people to tick boxes. Getting people to do a survey is no easy task. If it's more than 20 minutes, good luck. I mean, I have done one survey, and I had to do trial runs, and the people said, we won't do this unless it takes 10 minutes to complete. Anything longer, you're going to have to pay us. So I think it's just a fundamental issue of what kind of data are we talking about, and it's going to tell us something, but this survey data is definitely not going to get into the depth of what you're talking about, which is much deeper than a label or a given practice or so on and so forth.
Yeah, and I do interview a lot of non-religious people and get that narrative from them, and so does Phil. I've read his books, and it is more complicated than I'm non-religious and that's it. So it's a lot of I was non-religious and I became religious for a while, or I'm still kind of, I don't know yet for sure. There's a lot of people seeking out things like secular spirituality or kind of new labels that maybe will define something that they don't think atheist defines for them. So I think it's definitely more than the categories that we give them in surveys. And it changes over time. People go back and forth. People change their identities over time. So the surveys kind of capture where they're at in that moment, maybe even, maybe they are religious later in life too. So.
I guess part of what I was seeking is are there more commonalities that emerge in shared narratives that are differently expressed than doctrines and affiliations create differences and separations.
I think so, but we'll have to talk in the foyer. It's just a longer, I think I think there are certain patterns you will see, common ways of understanding the world, common ways of understanding death, morality, charity, faith, these things that, again, each person's different and there's idiosyncrasies and personal differences, but when you start to interview lots of people, you start to see certain things bubble to the surface, and I think there is some overlap between people of faith and non-people of faith, but I do think there's also some significant differences.
So my question actually was about, and I say this coming from a millennial perspective, is there's this there's this kind of idea that because millennials make up a larger proportion of non-religious people, that we have this inevitable march to more progressive ideology, that more people are going to be accepting of other people. I'm actually not convinced. I see in Western Europe a lot of xenophobia. There's a lot of actually a secular right. And so my question is actually of any research you have that might suggest that actually the growth of secularism does not necessarily equate to more progressive. There can be secular right as well.